The first clue is not a skull, not a stone tool, not a painted animal on a cave wall, but a small absence at the base of the spine. It is there in every living human body, hidden beneath skin and muscle, reduced to a curved cluster of bones that most people only notice when they fall hard enough to bruise it. The coccyx is often treated as a leftover, a quiet anatomical joke from an ancient past. But it is more than a useless remnant. It is a fossil carried inside the body. It is the place where a tale once continued, and somewhere deep in the lost forests of the Miocene, long before the first hand shaped a blade, long before fire glowed in a human camp, long before language began to gather the world into stories, a change in the body plan of an ape lineage became permanent. The tail shortened, the spine ended differently. Balance, movement, posture, birth, climbing, sitting, falling, standing, all began to enter a new arrangement. The scene is almost impossible to see directly. There is no single animal that can be pointed to with certainty and called the first tailless ancestor of humans. There is no perfect skeleton lying in the earth with a sign beside it. The evidence remains incomplete, scattered between living bodies, ancient bones, comparative anatomy, and DNA. Yet the absence itself is powerful. Monkeys still swing through branches with tails that act like counterweights, flags, signals, stabilizers, and sometimes almost like a fifth limb. Apes do not, humans do not, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, gibbons, and people all share this strange condition, a body without an external tail, descended from older primates that once had one. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, the mystery becomes sharper because the loss of the tail is not just a cosmetic detail. In an animal built for life in trees, a tail can matter. It helps with balance when moving along branches. It can steady a leap. It can shift the center of gravity. To lose it is not simply to misplace a decoration. It means the whole body must solve balance in another way. The torso, hips, spine, shoulders, and limbs must work together differently. In apes, the back becomes more upright. The shoulder becomes suited for reaching and suspending. The trunk becomes part of a body that can hang, climb, sit upright, and later, in one lineage, walk on two legs with a commitment no other ape ever fully makes. Scholars still debate how directly tail loss contributed to later bipedalism, but the timing is suggestive enough to feel like a door opening first. The tail vanishes among the ancestors of apes, and much later, one branch of those apes begins to stand and move across the ground in a new way. For most of scientific history, this vanished tail was explained from the outside. Anatomists could compare skeletons. Fossil hunters could search for ancient apes. Evolutionary biologists could infer relationships from shared traits. But the deeper mechanism, the actual change in the genetic instructions that helped alter the end of the spine, stayed hidden. Then modern genomics began to turn the mystery inward. The old question was no longer only what changed in the bones. It became what changed in the code before the bones ever formed. In early development, long before a creature is born, the body is assembled through signals, switches, timing, and cells responding to instructions with astonishing precision. A tail is not added at the end like an ornament. It grows from a developmental program. Change that program, even slightly, and the final body can be transformed. One of the most striking recent clues centers on a gene called TBXT, known for its role in shaping the posterior body during embryonic development. The important part is not simply that this gene exists. Many animals have versions of it. The important part is that, in the ancestors of apes, a small mobile piece of DNA appears to have inserted itself into a non-coding region of that gene. This inserted sequence, an element, did not create a brand new tail loss gene in the dramatic sense. It did something subtler and perhaps more haunting. It altered how the gene's message could be spliced, changing the way the instructions were read during development. In experiments designed to mimic aspects of this effect, mice could develop shortened or absent tails. That does not mean a mouse becomes an ape, and it does not mean one mutation alone explains humanity. No single explanation fully accounts for this, but it suggests that a small genetic event, buried not in the obvious protein coding text but in the regulatory and splicing machinery around it, may have helped push an ancient ape body away from the tailed primate form. This is where the story becomes larger than the tail. Human evolution is often imagined as a ladder of visible transformations. An ape comes down from the trees, stands upright, makes tools, grows a larger brain, speaks, paints, buries, builds, remembers. But nature does not work in neat steps arranged for later observers. It works through populations, variation, accidents, constraints, failed experiments, useful compromises, and changes that carry costs. The same research that points toward a possible genetic mechanism for tail loss also hints at a price. When developmental pathways involving the spine and tail are disturbed, risks can appear elsewhere, including defects of the neural tube. Evolution does not design from scratch. It modifies what is already there, often with side effects. A body can gain one advantage while inheriting a vulnerability that still echoes millions of years later. The ancient forest where this begins is not a human world yet. It is a world of warmth, leaves, wet bark, insects, fruiting trees, and primates moving through vertical space. The ancestors involved not human, not even close to human, in the way a face in a museum skull feels close. They are apes in the making, part of a broader radiation of primates whose relationships are still being revised as new fossils appear. Some live in Africa, some in Eurasia, some in landscapes that shift between forest and woodland as climates change. Their lives are ruled by food, predators, mating, injury, birth, and the constant geometry of branches. Yet inside them, in cells too small for any eye to see, ancient genetic systems are being edited by mutation, recombination, duplication, deletion, and the restless movement of repetitive DNA. Most changes disappear. Some do nothing obvious. Some are harmful. A few remain, not because they are destined for greatness, but because individuals carrying them survive and reproduce. That is the unnerving truth behind the phrase, the mutation that changed everything. It is not a lightning bolt striking one ape and producing humanity. It is more like a quiet alteration in a vast manuscript, one that only matters because the manuscript is copied again and again through generations, tested by bodies, environments, and time. The loss of the tail does not make a human. It does not create language, tools, imagination, or memory, but it changes the architecture from which later possibilities emerge. It belongs to the deep foundation of the ape body, and the human body is built on that foundation. The tail disappears first, and what remains is not emptiness. What remains is a spine that ends differently, a torso that balances differently, a pelvis that will one day be reshaped for walking, and a lineage that slowly becomes available to a future no ancient ape could have needed or foreseen. The strangest part is that this beginning is both intimate and almost unreachable. Every person carries the evidence, but no person can remember it. The tailbone sits at the base of the body like a sealed message from before the human story began. Fossils can show fragments of the bodies that came later. Genomes can reveal patterns of inheritance and change. Living apes can show what humans still share with their closest relatives, but the exact animals in which this transformation first took hold are gone, dissolved back into the earth, leaving behind only hints. What survives in the record suggests that humanity did not begin with a sudden awakening, but with a long series of physical compromises. Before the hand becomes fully human, before the brain expands into its extraordinary hunger, before words begin to cross the dark between minds, the body itself is already changing, and one of the earliest signs is an ending. The place where the tail no longer grows. The missing tail leads backward into a world that is not yet human, but it is also not simply the world of monkeys. It is a deeper and stranger landscape, a time when the ape body itself is still being tested by evolution. The forests are different from the forests that survive today. Rivers shift through warm valleys. Seasonal dry spells open patches of woodland. Fruit appears and disappears with the climate. Leaves, seeds, insects, bark, and hard-shelled food become the difference between survival and hunger. In this world, primates are not following a script toward humanity. They are branching outward, trying different shapes of life. Some remain small and agile. Some grow larger. Some move through branches from above and below. Others begin to use powerful arms and upright torsos in ways that make them look, from a distance, faintly familiar. The word ape can feel too simple for such a world. Today, it points toward a small surviving group, gibbons and siamangs in Asia, orangutans in the forests of Borneo and Sumatra, gorillas in Africa, chimpanzees and bonobos in African forests, and humans almost everywhere. But in the Miocene, apes are more diverse than their living descendants suggest. They appear in forms that do not fit neatly into modern categories. Some are known only from jaws, teeth, limb fragments, and scraps of skull. A few seem close to the lineages that later produce living apes. Others may be evolutionary side branches, experiments that flourish for a time and vanish. What survives in the record suggests not a ladder, but a thicket, many branches, many dead ends, and only one thin path that eventually leads toward the human lineage. This matters because the beginning of humanity is often imagined too late. The mind reaches for the first stone tool, the first upright walker, the first creature with a face recognizably close to ours. But the foundation lies much earlier, among ancient apes that never make tools, never control fire, never speak, never walk across open plains as humans do. Their importance is not in what they know, but in what their bodies become. The loss of the tail is one sign. So is a more flexible shoulder. So is the tendency toward an upright trunk that can help an ape climb, reach, suspend, sit, and later, in one lineage, balance above 2 feet. These are not human traits yet. They are ape traits first. Humanity inherits them and then reshapes them. The fossil map of these early apes keeps changing. For a long time, East Africa held much of the attention, partly because its fossil record is extraordinarily important, and partly because later human origins are so deeply tied to African landscapes. But new discoveries remind researchers that the early ape story is broader than one region. In northern Egypt, at Wadi Mogra, jaw fragments and teeth assigned to a newly described fossil ape called Masripithecus mograensis have drawn attention to North Africa in the early Miocene, around 17 to 18 million years ago. The fossils are not a complete body. They do not show how the animal climbed, sat, balanced, or moved through trees. They are pieces of a mouth, and a mouth can still speak across time if read carefully. The robust jaw, large canine and premolar teeth, and rounded molars suggest an ape able to process varied foods, perhaps mainly fruit, but also harder items when conditions demand it. That is a small detail with a large implication. Survival may have depended not on perfection, but on flexibility. Scholars still debate exactly where such fossils belong on the ape family tree. A jaw is not a family portrait, and a few teeth cannot settle the geography of ape origins by themselves. Yet the find is a useful warning against a clean, narrow story. Ancient apes are not confined to the places modern expectation finds most convenient. Their populations move, split, vanish, and reappear in landscapes that are not always generous to fossil preservation. Forest soils often destroy bones. Rivers scatter them. Erosion exposes them only by chance. A lineage can live for millions of years and leave almost nothing behind. This is one reason human origins can feel like a mystery, even when the science is strong. The process was real, but the archive is damaged. Modern genetics adds another kind of archive, one carried inside living apes. Complete and more accurate ape genomes are beginning to reveal regions that older methods could not resolve. Repetitive DNA, segmental duplications, centromeres, immune regions, and other difficult parts of the genome. These areas are not decorative clutter. Some are among the most dynamic regions in evolution, places where copying, rearrangement, and structural change can alter gene families and regulatory systems. The comparison between humans, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans, and siamangs is therefore not just a search for the few differences that make people unusual. It is a way of reconstructing the deep genetic landscape from which all living apes emerge. The more complete the genomes become, the less evolution looks like a simple list of human genes, and the more it looks like a history of switches, repeats, duplications, timing, and context. This is where the old idea of one decisive mutation begins to soften. A single change can matter. The alu insertion linked to tail loss may have mattered greatly, but the ape inheritance is made from many changes interacting across millions of years. Some affect bones, some affect muscles, some affect development before birth, some alter how cells divide, migrate, or respond to chemical signals. Others change nothing visible until the environment shifts, and a trait that was once neutral becomes useful or harmful. Evolution rarely announces which of these changes will matter later. It keeps what works well enough in a given population at a given time, and it leaves future consequences to chance. The inheritance passed from ancient apes into the human story is therefore both physical and hidden. It is visible in the shoulder blade, the spine, the wrist, the hip, the hand, the missing tail. It is hidden in the genome, in regions that guide development and in repetitive sequences once dismissed too easily because they were hard to read. It is present in the great apes alive today, not because they are ancestors, but because they are relatives, living branches that preserve different versions of a shared past. Chimpanzees and bonobos are not primitive humans. Gorillas are not failed humans. Orangutans are not museum pieces from our beginning. They are survivors of their own histories, and humans are another survivor, strange in some ways, deeply ordinary in others. At the base of the spine, the old absence remains, but now it belongs to a larger pattern. The vanished tail is not the opening note of humanity alone. It is part of the deeper ape condition, a transformation that precedes the human lineage and prepares the body for possibilities that natural selection does not yet aim toward. The next changes will not happen in a single leap. They will gather slowly in bones, muscles, ligaments, and developmental programs, until one branch of the ape family begins to do something both awkward and revolutionary. It begins to make walking upright not an occasional posture, but a way of life. The body that loses its tail is already telling a deeper story, one that is easy to misunderstand because the human mind loves clean beginnings. It wants a single spark, a single altered letter in the genome, a single moment when an ape becomes something more than an ape. It wants the mutation that changed everything. But the deeper the evidence goes, the less human origins look like one decisive switch. They look instead like a long storm of tiny edits, many of them almost invisible on their own, moving through bodies and populations for millions of years. Some change the shape of bones, some change the timing of growth, some change how cells behave before birth, some do not change the structure of a protein at all, but alter when, where, and how strongly a gene is used. The result is not a miracle, it is stranger than a miracle, because it is made from ordinary biological processes repeated across an almost unbearable span of time. This is one of the most important lessons modern genetics has brought into the ancient story. For much of the 20th century, it was tempting to imagine evolution mainly through visible traits, a longer limb, a larger skull, a smaller canine tooth, a pelvis reshaped for walking, a hand freed from constant locomotion. Fossils encourage this way of thinking, because fossils preserve the hard parts. They give researchers bones, teeth, joint surfaces, fragments of skull, and the occasional stone tool lying near a layer of ash or animal remains. But bodies do not begin as bones. They begin as development. A limb, a spine, a brain, a jaw, and a face form through cascades of genetic activity, through signals switching on and off, through cells dividing, migrating, folding, dying, thickening, thinning, and responding to their chemical surroundings. Evolution can transform an adult body by changing these early instructions only slightly. The surprising detail is that many of the differences that matter most may not sit inside the protein-coding parts of genes. They may lie in the regulatory landscape around them. For years, popular accounts of DNA often treated genes as if each one directly made a trait, like a row of labeled levers, a gene for height, a gene for intelligence, a gene for language, a gene for humanity. Real biology is much less obedient. The same gene can be used in different tissues at different times, in different amounts. A gene may help build one structure in the embryo, serve a different purpose later, and interact with dozens of other genes in ways that are difficult to separate. A change in regulation can therefore be powerful because it does not need to invent a new tool. It can use an old tool differently. In the human story, this is where the so-called human accelerated regions become so fascinating. These are stretches of DNA that are highly conserved across many animals, meaning they remained relatively stable for a long time, but changed unusually quickly in the human lineage after it split from the ancestors of chimpanzees and bonobos. That pattern is not proof that every one of these regions created something uniquely human, and scholars still debate the function of many of them. Yet their location is suggestive. Many sit near genes involved in brain development, limb formation, and the regulation of embryonic growth. They look less like new bricks in the wall and more like changes in the architectural instructions. They may alter the timing of development, the strength of gene activity, or the way tissues respond as a body takes shape. This is not the kind of evidence that makes a simple headline. A skull can be photographed. A stone hand axe can be held in the palm. A fossil footprint can make the past feel immediate. A regulatory DNA sequence does none of that. It is abstract, silent, and easily exaggerated if treated carelessly. But it may be where some of the deepest transformations happen. The hand that later grips a tool, the pelvis that later balances a walking body, the cortex that later expands into a long childhood of learning, all depend on developmental timing. Evolution does not always need to create a new structure from nothing. Sometimes it stretches a growth period. Sometimes it slows one process and accelerates another. Sometimes it changes the number of dividing cells in a forming tissue. Sometimes it alters the spacing of a limb, the curvature of a spine, the thickness of a bone, or the architecture of the brain by changing a switch rather than a protein. The brain makes this especially clear. Humans do not have the largest brain in nature, and brain size alone does not explain the human condition. Elephants and whales carry vast nervous systems. Neanderthals had brains as large as, and sometimes larger than, those of living humans. What matters is not size in isolation, but development, organization, connectivity, metabolism, social learning, and the long period of childhood in which the brain remains open to experience. Recent research into human-specific enhancers, including regions such as HAIR5, suggests that small regulatory differences can influence the behavior of neural progenitor cells, including radial glia, the cells that help build the cerebral cortex. A subtle change in how these cells divide or persist can influence the number and arrangement of neurons. This does not explain consciousness. It does not solve the mystery of imagination. The evidence remains incomplete. But it shows how a tiny shift in a developmental switch can echo outward into the architecture of a brain. There is a kind of humility in this. The human brain is often treated as the crown of evolution, as though life had been climbing toward it all along. But the genome does not read the future. It does not know about art, astronomy, burial rites, agriculture, cities, mathematics, or the long videos people will one day make about their own origins. The genetic changes that matter in human evolution survive first because they function in bodies under pressure, bodies seeking food, avoiding injury, caring for offspring, navigating social tension, enduring heat, cold, hunger, disease, and competition. A change that later becomes part of symbolic thought may begin as a minor alteration in development. A change that later helps shape speech may first affect cells, circuits, timing, or motor control in ways no early ape could have recognized as special. This is why the phrase "the mutation that changed everything" must be handled carefully. There are mutations that matter enormously. The insertion associated with tail loss may be one. Certain changes in regulatory regions linked to brain development may be others. Variants affecting the vocal tract, neural timing, immune response, metabolism, pigmentation, altitude adaptation, and skeletal form all become important at different points in the human journey. But no single mutation stands alone like a throne. Each one enters a living population already carrying a long inheritance. Each one is filtered through environment and chance. Each one interacts with other changes, many of them older, many of them still poorly understood. No single explanation fully accounts for humanity because humanity is not a single trait. The ancient ape body, then, is not becoming human in a straight line. It is accumulating possibilities. The missing tail changes balance and posture. The upright trunk changes how weight moves through the body. The shoulder allows new ranges of reaching and suspension. The hand, freed in certain contexts from constant support, becomes available for manipulation. The developing brain becomes slightly altered by changes in timing and regulation. None of these alone is enough. Together, across millions of years, they create a creature that can face a changing world with unusual flexibility. The transformation is not sudden. It is slow, uneven, and filled with branches that disappear. Somewhere in this long process, the question of walking begins to grow more urgent. A tailless ape can still live in trees. A flexible shoulder does not require open country. A clever hand does not demand a savanna. But climates shift, forests break and reconnect. Food becomes patchier in some places, and ground travel begins to matter in new ways. The genome has already altered the old primate body. The next great change will be written in hips, knees, feet, and spine. It will look awkward at first, perhaps even improbable. But once one lineage begins to trust 2 legs more than 4, the story moves into a new landscape, and the ancient ape inheritance starts to become recognizably human. The first true commitment to walking upright does not begin with a heroic stride across an open plain. It begins awkwardly, in bodies that still belong partly to the trees. The ancient ape inheritance does not vanish when the feet touch the ground. Long arms, curved fingers, powerful shoulders, grasping habits, climbing instincts, and a torso shaped by arboreal life remain present for a long time. Early hominins are not born as miniature versions of modern humans. They are mosaics, made of old and new features arranged in combinations that would look strange beside any living species. Some can probably climb well. Some can stand and walk on 2 legs more often than their ape relatives. Some may move through woodland edges, gallery forests, wetlands, and broken habitats where neither tree life nor ground life alone is enough. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in the record suggests that upright walking begins not as a clean replacement for climbing, but as an evolutionary compromise. This is where the human body begins to look truly improbable. A chimpanzee can stand, a gorilla can rear upright, an orangutan can move bipedally along branches with astonishing control, but they do not make bipedal walking their main form of travel on the ground. Humans do. That difference requires the body to solve a series of mechanical problems. The head must balance over the spine. The spine must curve in a way that stacks weight efficiently. The pelvis must become shorter and broader, able to support organs while also anchoring muscles that stabilize the trunk with each step. The femur must angle inward so the knees fall beneath the body's center of gravity. The foot must become less like a grasping hand and more like a spring, lever, and shock absorber. The big toe must align with the others. The ankle must bear repeated force. Even the rhythm of breathing, balance, pregnancy, childbirth, and carrying food or infants becomes entangled with this new way of moving. No single bone creates bipedalism by itself. A pelvis without the right foot is not enough. A human-like knee without a compatible spine is not enough. A skull balanced on the wrong neck would waste energy. This is why fossils are so valuable and so frustrating. A single fragment can be suggestive, but walking is a whole body behavior. Researchers look for clues in the angle of the femur, the shape of the pelvis, the position of the foramen magnum at the base of the skull, the curvature of toe bones, the structure of the ankle, and in rare moments of extraordinary preservation, footprints pressed into ancient ground. Each clue carries meaning, but each also has limits. Scholars still debate the locomotion of several early hominins because the record is patchy, and because evolution often produces bodies that do not fit modern categories neatly. One of the earliest and most debated candidates stands near the shadowy beginning of the human lineage Sahelanthropus chadensis. From around 7 million years ago, its skull, found far from the classic East African fossil fields, has a face with features that some researchers interpret as surprisingly hominin-like, and the position of the opening where the spinal cord enters the skull has been used to argue that it may have held its head in a more upright posture. Later analysis of limb material has added fuel to the debate, suggesting possible adaptations for bipedal movement while also preserving abilities useful in trees. But this creature does not step cleanly out of the forest as a confirmed ancestor in the simple way popular stories might prefer. Its place remains contested. The fossils are limited, interpretations differ, and no single discovery can carry the entire burden of explaining the origin of upright walking. Still, Sahelanthropus matters because it pulls the question deep into time, toward the period near the split between the line leading to humans and the line leading to chimpanzees and bonobos. After that dark beginning, other names emerge: Ardipithecus, Australopithecus, and a widening cast of early hominins whose bodies show different experiments in walking, climbing, feeding, and surviving. Ardipithecus ramidus, living around 4.5 million years ago, appears to combine a form of bipedality with a foot that still has a divergent big toe, useful for grasping. It is not a knuckle-walking ape turning directly into a human. It hints at something more complex. The last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees may not have been chimpanzee-like in the modern sense. That is a lesser-known but crucial point. Living chimpanzees are not frozen ancestors. They too have evolved for millions of years. The origin of bipedalism may have passed through forms that were unlike both modern humans and modern African apes. By the time Australopithecus afarensis moves through East Africa, the evidence for habitual bipedalism becomes much stronger. The famous footprints at Laetoli, preserved in volcanic ash more than 3.5 million years ago, show individuals walking across a landscape that had briefly become a recording surface. Their feet press into ash hardens, time buries the trackway, and millions of years later the traces reappear. They are not footprints of modern people, but they are unmistakably connected to upright walking. Each print is a moment of weight transfer, heel to forefoot, body balanced above two legs. Nearby in the broader fossil record, the skeleton known as Lucy shows a pelvis, femur, knee, and other traits consistent with bipedal locomotion, though her long arms and shoulder region still speak of climbing. Again, the body is a mosaic. Ground and tree have not fully separated. The pelvis is one of the deepest transformations in this story. It is not simply a basin of bone. It is a record of posture, movement, birth, muscle force, and development. Recent research into how the human pelvis forms suggests that the shift toward a bipedal pelvis may have involved stage changes in development, not merely the slow enlargement or shrinking of an existing ape shape. The ilium, the broad upper blade of the hip bone, becomes shorter and wider in humans, and its orientation changes in ways that help muscles stabilize the body during single-leg support. Every human step includes a brief moment when the entire body is balanced above one leg. Without the right pelvic architecture, The trunk would lurch from side to side with exhausting force. The reshaped ilium helps prevent that collapse. Hidden behind this adult anatomy are developmental changes in cartilage, bone formation, and gene regulation during embryonic growth. Once again, the visible skeleton is the final surface of a deeper genetic and developmental process. The cost is real. Human walking is efficient, but the body pays for it in other ways. Lower back pain, knee injuries, hip wear, ankle strain, and the difficulty of childbirth are not accidents unrelated to evolution. They are partly consequences of a body modified from an ape inheritance rather than engineered from nothing. The pelvis must serve walking, support internal organs, anchor muscles, and allow birth of large-brained infants. No perfect solution exists. Evolution finds workable compromises, and humans live inside them. The same pelvis that helps a person cross continents can make birth dangerous. The same spine that stacks the body upright can ache under load. The same foot that works as a lever sacrifices the grasping freedom of earlier primates. Progress is the wrong word if it suggests smooth improvement. Adaptation is better, because adaptation always belongs to a particular problem, in a particular environment, with particular trade-offs. Upright walking also changes the social world. Hands are no longer required for every step. They can carry food, infants, stones, sticks, gathered plants, scavenged meat, or later, shaped tools. A body standing higher sees differently across grasses, shrubs, and broken woodland. Long-distance travel becomes more efficient under some conditions. Heat management may change as less body surface faces direct midday sun, and more air moves around the body. These possibilities do not all appear at once, and no single explanation fully accounts for why bipedalism evolves. Some theories emphasize food carrying, others emphasize energy efficiency, thermoregulation, feeding posture, display, wading, climbing in flexible branches, or life in mixed habitats. Many ideas capture part of the truth, but none alone explains the whole pattern. The ancient ape has now become something more specific, though still not human in the modern sense. It is a hominin, a creature on the human side of the split, shaped by an upright experiment that will never be reversed. The tail is gone. The torso has changed. The pelvis is changing. The foot is becoming a platform. The hands are increasingly available to interact with the world in new ways. But the brain has not yet become the vast symbolic engine of later Homo sapiens. The first revolution is not thought. It is posture. The body rises before the mind remakes the world. Once the body rises, the hands begin to enter the story in a different way. They have always been important. Primates are hand animals long before humans appear. A monkey grips branches, searches fur, picks fruit, tests surfaces, and feels the world through fingers that are densely wired to the nervous system. An ape does even more. It climbs, hangs, pulls, cracks, tears, carries, gestures, and manipulates objects with a flexibility that hints at possibilities not yet fully realized. But when one lineage makes walking upright a habit, the hands are released from constant duty as front limbs. They are not freed in a magical instant, and early hominins still climb, brace, and use their arms for balance and survival. Yet the direction is unmistakable. The hand is becoming less tied to locomotion and more available for investigation. This change is easy to underestimate because the human hand looks ordinary to those who live with it. It seems natural to pinch a small object between thumb and finger, to rotate a stone in the palm, to pull a strip from a plant stem, to hold meat steady, to carry a child, to point toward danger, to shape one thing with another. But the human hand is not just a smaller ape hand. It has a particular arrangement of thumb length, finger proportions, wrist stability, muscle control, and nerve feedback that allows force and precision to coexist. A chimpanzee hand is powerful, and chimpanzees can use tools in impressive ways, but the human hand becomes unusually suited to repeated fine manipulation, especially when combined with a brain increasingly able to plan sequences of action. The earliest clear stone tools appear more than 3 million years ago in some African contexts, though scholars still debate which hominins made them, and how often such behaviours occurred before the better-known older one traditions. This uncertainty matters. The first toolmakers may not have belonged to the genus Homo. Australopithecines or other early hominins may have struck stones together, cut flesh, opened bones, or processed plant materials long before the classic image of toolmaking becomes attached to early humans. What survives in the record is bias towards stone because stone endures. Wood, bark, fibre, skin, sinew, digging sticks, carrying slings, and simple containers could have mattered enormously and vanished almost entirely. The archaeology of early technology is therefore probably only the hardest edge of a much larger, softer world. A stone flake is a small object, but it carries dramatic implication. To make one, a hominin must recognize stone as more than stone. It must see that a cobble can be transformed, that one rock can strike another at the right angle, that a sharp edge can be produced and used elsewhere. The action may be simple compared with later hand axes, blades, needles, boats, or bows, but it already links perception, movement, memory, and intention. It also changes the body's relationship to food. A sharp flake can slice hide, remove meat from bone, cut tendons, scrape plant fibers, and open access to nutrients that teeth and nails alone cannot reach efficiently. It extends the body outward into the world. The hand no longer merely grasps what nature provides. It begins to create a temporary tooth from stone. This is where teeth quietly tell their own story. Across hominin evolution, chewing anatomy changes in complicated ways. Some early forms have large jaws and powerful chewing muscles adapted to tough or hard foods. Later members of Homo often show smaller teeth and faces, though the pattern is not simple and does not move in one direction everywhere. Tool use, food processing, meat eating, marrow extraction, pounding, cutting, and eventually cooking all alter the pressures placed on the mouth. The surprising detail is that the first major technological changes do not need to look dramatic to matter. A flake used to cut meat before chewing changes the division of labor between hand, tool, tooth, and gut. A stone used to crack bone opens marrow. A dense food hidden behind a natural container. A digging stick can reach underground storage organs that are invisible from above. These acts do not make survival easy, but they make it more flexible. Flexibility may be one of the deepest themes of human evolution. Ancient apes survive in particular habitats. Early hominins begin to survive across more varied ones. They do not become invincible. They remain vulnerable to drought, predators, disease, injury, childbirth, and competition. But a creature that walks efficiently, carries food, uses hands skillfully, and learns socially can buffer itself against change in new ways. It can exploit patches of landscape that would otherwise be marginal. It can remember where seasonal foods appear. It can return to carcasses. It can carry stones to places where suitable raw material is absent. It can learn from another individual's success without rediscovering everything alone. No single explanation fully accounts for this growing adaptability, but tools are one of its clearest surviving traces. The brain is already involved, yet it's not simply expanding like a balloon. Early tool use depends on sensory control, motor planning, attention, and learning. It requires the body to coordinate eyes, hands, posture, and force. It also favors social transmission, because a useful technique can spread if others watch, imitate, practice, and improve. The line between biology and culture begins to blur. Genetic changes shape the hand and brain, but learned behavior changes the pressures acting on bodies. If cutting tools make certain foods available, diet changes. If diet changes, growth, reproduction, energy budgets, and survival may shift. If young individuals must learn complex skills, childhood and social tolerance matter more. Culture does not float above evolution. It becomes part of the environment in which evolution operates. A lesser-known point is that stone tools themselves can preserve mistakes. Archaeologists studying early toolmaking do not only look for perfect flakes or elegant cores. They look for the pattern of strikes, failed removals, battered edges, raw material choices, and discarded fragments. These traces reveal behavior at a scale far more intimate than a skull. A fossil jaw shows anatomy. A scatter of stone debris shows action. It shows a hand striking, missing, correcting, trying again. It shows learning and perhaps teaching, though the evidence for teaching in the modern sense remains uncertain. It shows that intelligence in deep time is not always displayed as art or architecture. Sometimes it appears as a pile of broken stones in the dust. The world around these early tool users is not a stable stage. Grasslands expand and contract. Woodlands shift. Lakes rise and shrink. Volcanic eruptions lay down ash that later helps date fossil layers. Animal communities change as antelope, horses, pigs, elephants, carnivores, and scavengers move through altered habitats. A hominin standing beside a carcass is not alone. Hyenas, big cats, vultures, and other scavengers may be nearby. Access to meat may involve risk, timing, group behavior, and opportunism. Early humans and their relatives are not always hunters in the heroic sense. Sometimes they are scavengers, sometimes they are gatherers, sometimes they are prey. The evidence remains incomplete, and the balance between hunting and scavenging varies across time and place. But the tool in the hand gives them a new way to enter the contest. By the time early members of the genus Homo appear, the body and behavior are becoming more deeply entangled. Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, Homo erectus, and other forms do not line up as simple steps in a parade. Their relationships are debated, their fossils overlap, and the boundaries between species are not always clean. Yet something is changing. Brain size trends upward in some lineages. Legs become more suited for longer distance walking and running. Hands become increasingly capable of precision. Stone tools become more widespread. Bodies begin to move beyond Africa. The ancient ape inheritance is still present, but it is being reorganized around endurance, manipulation, learning, and ecological reach. The mutation that changed everything is no longer one event. It has become a chain of consequences. Tail loss alters the ape body. Upright walking frees the hands more often. Hands change the value of objects. Objects change diet. Diet changes energy. Energy affects growth and brains. Brains alter learning. Learning changes survival. Survival changes which bodies leave descendants. The story is cumulative, and every layer depends on older layers beneath it. The human hand, holding a sharp stone at the edge of an ancient carcass, is not the beginning of humanity. It is one of the first places where the body's deep evolutionary history becomes visible as behavior. The ape has not disappeared. It has learned to strike stone. A hand can strike stone, but stone alone does not explain the creature holding it. The deeper change now gathers inside the skull, where the most expensive organ in the body begins to demand more from everything around it. A brain is not just a mass of tissue. It is an appetite. It consumes energy even when the body is still, even when the eyes are closed, even when no tool is being made and no danger is visible. For a small mammal, this appetite can be manageable. For a growing hominin lineage, it becomes a biological bargain. A larger, more complex brain must be fed, protected, cooled, grown, taught, and carried through a long period of dependency. It offers possibilities, but it also creates costs. Evolution does not enlarge such an organ casually. The fossil record shows that brain expansion in the human line is not immediate after bipedalism. For millions of years, upright walking exists alongside brains that are still relatively modest in size. Australopithecines walk on two legs, use their hands in increasingly important ways, and survive across changing African environments. Yet their brains remain much closer in scale to those of other apes than to later humans. This is a crucial point because it breaks the old image of human evolution as a quick rise from ape body to human mind. The body stands first. The hands become increasingly available. The brain follows in a more uneven rhythm, expanding significantly in later Homo, especially with Homo erectus, and then still further in later humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens. The mind does not awaken in one clean moment. It accumulates. What changes inside the brain is harder to see than the size of the brain case. Fossil skulls can show cranial capacity, overall shape, and sometimes impressions of blood vessels or surface anatomy on the inner skull. They cannot show thoughts. They cannot show language, memory, grief, curiosity, planning, or the feeling of watching a storm move across a valley. Brain size matters, but it is a blunt instrument. A larger brain may support more complex behavior, but the organization of that brain, the timing of development, the pattern of connections, and the social world in which it grows are all just as important. Neanderthals, for instance, had very large brains, yet their developmental history, body proportions, ecology, and cultural trajectories were not identical to those of Homo sapiens. No single measure fully accounts for what makes a mind. Modern genetics has begun to reveal why the old search for a simple brain gene was too narrow. Humans share the overwhelming majority of their protein-coding genes with other apes. The difference does not lie in a separate set of magical instructions, but in altered regulation, timing, dosage, and interaction. Human accelerated regions, including sequences near genes involved in nervous system development, point toward this deeper layer. Some of these regions act like enhancers, influencing when and where genes are active during embryonic growth. A small difference in such a switch can affect how neural progenitor cells divide, how long they remain active, how many neurons are produced, and how developing tissues are patterned. The result may be subtle in the beginning, but development amplifies subtle changes. A slight shift early can become a different architecture later. One of the most striking examples involves regulatory regions such as HAR5, which has been studied for its influence on brain development. In simplified terms, changes in such enhancers may alter the activity of genes during the formation of the cerebral cortex. the outer brain region involved in perception, movement, attention, planning, and many forms of higher cognition. The important cells here include radial glia, which act both as progenitors that produce neurons and as scaffolds along which young neurons migrate. If the behavior of these cells changes, even slightly, the developing cortex may change with them. This does not mean that one enhancer creates the human mind. It does not explain art, mathematics, myth, or the ability to imagine the dead. The evidence remains incomplete, but it shows how evolution can work through developmental timing rather than through sudden invention. A larger brain also changes childhood. Human infants are born unusually helpless compared with many mammals, and human children remain dependent for a long time. This long dependency can look like a weakness, and in a dangerous Pleistocene world it certainly carries risk. An infant cannot run from predators. A child cannot survive alone. A mother needs support, food, protection, and social tolerance. But long childhood also creates a vast learning window. A brain that remains plastic for years can absorb tools, landscapes, social rules, food traditions, gestures, dangers, and later language. It can learn not only what is present, but what others know. The slow-growing child becomes a vessel for accumulated culture. Biology opens the door, and social life fills the room. The energetic problem remains severe. Brain tissue is costly. To support it, hominins need reliable calories. This does not mean meat alone explains the human brain, though animal foods likely become important in many contexts. Marrow, fat, organs, insects, tubers, seeds, fruits, nuts, honey, and later cooked foods all contribute to different populations at different times. Stone tools help access hidden nutrients. Cooperation helps distribute risk. Sharing may become more important when food comes in large packages, such as carcasses, or when some individuals are better at finding certain resources than others. Scholars still debate exactly how diet, tool use, social behavior, and brain expansion influenced each other. But the patterns suggest feedback rather than a single cause. Better tools improve access to food. Better food supports larger brains. Larger brains improve learning and cooperation. Better cooperation improves survival and child rearing. Each turn of the wheel strengthens the next. Fire eventually transforms this bargain even more, though control of fire is itself a long and debated story. Cooked food can be easier to chew and digest, and it can release more usable energy from some foods. Fire also changes night, safety, social gathering, and the rhythm of the day. But it should not be placed too early or too neatly into the story as the single key that unlocks the brain. Evidence for fire use varies in age and certainty, and regular control of fire appears more securely in later periods than the first appearance of Homo. What can be said carefully is that food processing in many forms, from cutting and pounding to cooking, reduces some of the work once done by teeth and gut. The body's energy economy changes, and the brain is part of that economy. Inside this expanding brain, another transformation begins to gather around communication. Many animals communicate, and apes are socially intelligent creatures with rich gestures, vocalizations, alliances, and emotional lives. The human path does not begin from silence. It begins from an already social primate foundation, but over time, the ability to coordinate attention, remember individuals, learn from others, interpret intention, and organize action becomes increasingly valuable. A group that can share information about danger, food, routes, tools, and social obligations has an advantage. Before full language exists, There may be gesture, vocal control, facial expression, rhythm, pointing, imitation, and shared attention. The border between communication and language is not a sharp line preserved in bone. Genes connected to neural development and vocal control add another layer, but again the story resists simplicity. FOXP2 became famous because it is associated with speech and language ability in modern humans, yet it is not a language gene in isolation, and Neanderthals carried the same key protein coding changes as modern humans. More recent work on genes such as NOVA1 involved in RNA regulation in the brain suggests that human-specific variants may have influenced neural development and vocalization-related traits in experimental models. Such findings are fascinating, but they must be held with care. A change observed in a model organism is not a direct recording of ancient speech. It is a clue, not a resurrection. What survives in the genetic record suggests that the evolution of language-related capacity involved many interacting changes, not one switch that suddenly made a human voice. By now, the old ape lineage has become something profoundly unstable in evolutionary terms: a body that walks, hands that manipulate, a brain that learns intensely, and a social life that increasingly stores survival outside the genome. A stone tool can be copied, a route can be remembered, a food tradition can be passed on, a warning can spread, a child can inherit not only DNA, but habits. This is one of the great turning points in the story. Evolution still acts on bodies, but culture begins to carry information at a speed genes cannot match. The mutation that changed everything has become a misleading phrase, unless it is understood as a doorway into a larger truth. Small genetic changes help build a creature capable of cumulative learning, and cumulative learning changes the world that creature must survive. The skull has not yet reached its final human form. The mind inside it is not yet the mind of a painter in a cave or a navigator crossing oceans. But the pressure is building. The brain is becoming a landscape where biology and culture meet, where inherited development creates the capacity for learning, and learning reshapes the value of inherited traits. The next traces will appear not only in bones and genes, but in movement across continents, in footprints beyond Africa, in tools scattered over enormous distances, and in the first signs that one kind of ape has become a traveller of the earth. The traveller does not appear suddenly at the edge of Africa with a map in its hand. It appears as a body already shaped by millions of years of compromise, a spine balanced above the hips, legs lengthening beneath the trunk, hands increasingly skilled, teeth and jaws changing with food and tools, a brain growing costly and flexible inside the skull. Movement is not new. Animals have always moved. Apes move through forests, across branches, between feeding grounds and sleeping places. But this new kind of movement begins to stretch the scale of the hominin world. Distances grow wider, habitats become more varied. A lineage that once belonged to local African landscapes begins to appear far beyond them, not because it has conquered the planet in any modern sense, but because its way of surviving is becoming unusually portable. The great name associated with this widening world is Homo erectus, though even that name carries complications. Some fossils are assigned to Homo erectus, others to Homo ergaster, and scholars still debate how best to divide the African and Asian forms. The boundaries are not as clean as a museum label suggests. What matters for the story is the pattern by around 2 million years ago. Hominins with bodies more suited to long-distance walking and perhaps endurance movement are present in Africa, and soon after, related populations appear in Eurasia, at Dmanisi, in what is now Georgia. Fossils dating to roughly 1.8 million years ago show early Homo outside Africa with a surprising mix of traits. Their brains are not huge, their bodies and faces vary, their stone tools are relatively simple, yet they are already far from the presumed African homeland. The implication is powerful. The first major expansion beyond Africa may not have required a fully modern brain or advanced technology. It may have required flexibility, tolerance for risk, and the ability to make a living in changing environments. Dmanisi also offers one of the most humanly unsettling details in early prehistory. Among the fossils is an individual with severe tooth loss, someone who survived long enough for the jawbone to remodel after the teeth were gone. This does not prove kindness in the modern emotional sense, and the evidence must be handled carefully. But it does suggest that survival was possible even with serious impairment, perhaps because of soft foods, group tolerance, or social conditions that allowed a weakened individual to endure. In a story often told through weapons, migration, and adaptation, a toothless jaw may be one of the quieter signs that early Homo was already living in a social world where bodies did not survive by anatomy alone. The landscapes these travelers enter are not empty corridors waiting for humans. They're alive with predators, prey, mountains, rivers, deserts, forests, grasslands, volcanic fields, wetlands, and seasonal extremes. The climate pulses. Glacial and interglacial rhythms reshape habitats over long cycles. Lakes expand and shrink. Rain belts move. Forests open into savannas, then close again in some places. Herd animals follow vegetation. Carnivores follow herds. Hominins follow opportunity, water. Stone, shelter, carcasses, plants, and one another. Migration is too clean a word if it suggests a planned expedition. Much of this movement is probably gradual range expansion, generations spreading along usable habitats, retreating when conditions worsen, surviving in refuges, disappearing from some regions, and reappearing in others. This is where the body of Homo erectus becomes so important. Compared with earlier Australopithecines, many erectus-like bodies show longer legs, narrower hips relative to body size, and proportions more suited to travelling on the ground. The famous Nariokotome boy from Kenya, dating to around 1.5 million years ago, reveals a tall, long-limbed youth whose skeleton suggests a creature capable of efficient walking across open country. But even here, caution is needed. One skeleton is not an entire species, and growth patterns in early Homo may not match modern humans exactly. The evidence remains incomplete. Still, the impression is striking. The hominin body is becoming less tied to trees and more committed to the ground, not merely standing upright, but moving through distance as a regular part of life. Movement changes everything because it forces encounters with novelty. A population that remains in one familiar habitat can specialize. A population that spreads across many habitats must improvise. New plants must be tested. New animals must be watched. New stones must be recognized as useful or useless. New shelters must be found. New dangers must be remembered. The genetic inheritance gives the body capacity, but learned behavior must fill in the local details. A toolmaking tradition carried into a new region may remain useful, but only if the right raw materials exist. A food habit may work in one valley and fail in another. Knowledge becomes local, practical, and fragile. It must be learned again by each child, and it must be carried in groups rather than in bone. The archaeological trace of this expansion is uneven. Stone tools appear across wide areas, but they do not always look the same. The Oldowan, with its flakes, cores, and simple cutting edges, persists for a long time. Later, Acheulean hand axes and cleavers appear in parts of Africa and Eurasia, shaped with greater symmetry and planning. These tools can seem almost ceremonial in their beauty, though most are practical objects. A hand axe is a cutting edge, a butchery tool, a woodworking implement, a multi-purpose technology, and perhaps in some cases a signal of skill. Yet the famous Movius line once suggested a division between regions where Acheulean hand axes were common and parts of East Asia where they seemed rare or absent. That pattern is now more complicated than early models allowed, but it remains a reminder that human technological evolution does not advance everywhere in the same way at the same pace. Different populations solve problems differently. As hominins move outward, they also encounter new forms of selection: heat, cold, altitude, pathogens, sunlight, diet, and isolation begin to matter in different combinations. The mutations that survive in one environment may be neutral or even harmful in another. Skin, immune systems, metabolism, body proportions, and developmental timing all become part of local adaptation over deep time. Much later, in other human groups, genetic traces will reveal adaptation to high altitude, cold climates, disease environments, and diet. But the deeper principle is already present. Movement turns the world into a patchwork of tests. There is no single best human body. There are only bodies that work well enough in particular circumstances long enough to leave descendants. At the same time, movement increases the chance of separation. Populations spread out, become isolated, change in different ways, and sometimes meet again after long periods apart. This is one of the roots of the later human family Neanderthals in Western Eurasia, Denisovans known from DNA and scattered remains in Asia, Homo sapiens in Africa, and other forms whose names are still debated or whose fossils remain too fragmentary to classify easily. The old image of one species replacing another in a clean sequence has given way to something messier. Human evolution is a branching, braided river. Some channels dry out, some merge, some leave faint sediment in the genetic record. Some are known only from a jaw, a tooth, a skull cap, or a few molecules preserved in a cave. The traveller, then, is not yet modern humanity, but it has crossed a threshold. An ape lineage that once belonged to forests has become a ground-moving, tool-using, socially learning animal capable of living across continents. Its power is not domination. It is adaptability. It can follow water, endure uncertainty, make edges from stone, carry knowledge in groups, and turn unfamiliar landscapes into survivable ones. The mutation that changed everything is now multiplied into a larger truth. The human line is shaped not by one change, but by the ability of many changes to work together inside moving bodies, and as those bodies spread, the story becomes harder to trace, because the family is no longer one shadow on one landscape. It is many shadows, moving through many worlds. As the travellers spread, the human family begins to lose the simplicity that later people try to impose on it. A straight road would be comforting ancient apes, upright walkers, tool makers, larger brains, modern humans. But the ground record refuses to behave that neatly. By the Middle and later Pleistocene, the world is inhabited not by one human form waiting to become us, but by several kinds of humans and near-humans, each adapted to its own history. Some live in Africa. Some survive in Europe and Western Asia. Some move through the cold and broken landscapes of northern Eurasia. Some occupy islands and tropical forests where bones decay quickly, and the archaeological record becomes thin. Some are known from skulls and skeletons, others are known mostly from DNA, as if their bodies have vanished but their inheritance has not. This is where the story becomes both more scientific and more ghostly. For most of the history of paleoanthropology, bones carried the main evidence. A jaw could define a species, a brow ridge could start an argument, a molar could redraw a map. Researchers measured skulls, compared limb bones, studied stone tools, and built family trees from the shapes that survived. Then ancient DNA entered the field and changed the scale of the mystery. DNA does not replace fossils, but it can reveal relationships that bones alone cannot. It can show interbreeding where skeletons appear separate. It can uncover unknown populations where no clear skull has yet been found. It can tell researchers that a fragment of bone smaller than a fingertip belonged not to a modern human or a Neanderthal, but to a distinct branch of the human family. The most famous example comes from Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, a place where the landscape itself feels like a corridor between worlds. The cave sits near forests, rivers, steppe, and mountain routes, a shelter used again and again across deep time. In its sediments, archaeologists find layers left by different occupants, different climates, different moments of survival. For decades, such a cave might have been interpreted mainly through tools, animal bones, hearth traces, and the few human remains that could be recognized by shape. But one tiny finger bone from a young individual changed the story. Its DNA revealed a population previously unknown to science: Denisovans. They were not simply Neanderthals, and they were not modern humans. They were relatives, cousins in the broader human family, separated from the Neanderthal lineage but close enough to interbreed with both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens at different times. This discovery matters for the theme of mutation, because it shows that human evolution is not only the story of new changes appearing inside one line, it is also the story of different human populations carrying different histories, separating, adapting, meeting, and exchanging genes. Evolution does not happen only by mutation, followed by inheritance within a single population. It also happens when populations that have been apart come together again, and genes that evolved in one environment enter another. This process, known as introgression, is one of the most surprising revelations of ancient DNA. The human genome is not a pure manuscript copied down one ancestral line. It is a palimpsest, written over, patched, revised, and sometimes enriched by encounters between groups that had been separated for hundreds of thousands of years. Neanderthals are the clearest example for many people because their bones are abundant compared with Denisovans. They live across Europe and Western Asia for a vast span of time, enduring glacial climates, hunting large animals, making tools, using fire, occupying caves and open-air sites, and leaving behind burials or possible mortuary behaviors that scholars still debate in detail. They are not brutish failures, despite old stereotypes. They are deeply adapted humans with large brains, strong bodies, and complex survival strategies, yet even they are no longer understood only through fossils. Their DNA reveals that many people outside Africa carry Neanderthal ancestry today, usually a small percentage, inherited from interbreeding after Homo sapiens expanded into Eurasia. Some of those inherited variants affect immune response, skin biology, metabolism, and other traits, though the effects are often complex and not always beneficial. Denisovans are more elusive. Their physical remains are painfully limited: a few teeth, fragments of bone, a jaw from the Tibetan plateau, and genetic traces from cave sediments. For a group that may have ranged across enormous parts of Asia, The visible fossil evidence is almost absurdly small. Yet their genetic legacy is large in certain populations today, especially among indigenous peoples of Oceania, including Papuan groups, and in varying amounts across parts of Asia. This uneven distribution suggests a deep and complicated history of encounters between modern humans and Denisovan-related populations. There may not have been just one Denisovan population. Genetic evidence suggests structure, diversity, perhaps multiple branches spread across different regions. The evidence remains incomplete, but the ghost in the genome is not a single shadow. It may be a whole vanished landscape of human variation. One of the most striking Denisovan legacies involves high-altitude adaptation in Tibetans, a version of the EPAS1 gene region, associated with efficient adaptation to low oxygen at high altitude, appears to have come from Denisovan-related ancestry. This does not mean Denisovans invented altitude survival in a conscious sense. It means that a genetic variant shaped in an archaic human population entered the ancestors of Tibetans through interbreeding and later became useful in the harsh environment of the Tibetan plateau. In that one example, the ancient meeting between human groups becomes visible in living bodies. Breath at high altitude carries a memory of contact. A person walking under thin air may carry, in the regulation of blood and oxygen response, a trace of humans who vanished long before written history. This changes the emotional shape of disappearance. If a human group leaves no cities, no writing, no monuments, and almost no bones, it can seem gone beyond recovery. But DNA complicates that ending. A population may disappear as a visible group while parts of its ancestry continue in others. Absorption can look like extinction from one angle and survival from another. Neanderthals are gone as a distinct population, yet Neanderthal DNA persists. Denisovans are gone as a named people, yet Denisovan ancestry survives in scattered living genomes. The word disappeared remains useful, but it is not simple. Some human stories end in bones, some end in silence. Some continue as inherited variants, detached from the faces and languages of the people who first carried them. The older question of the mutation that changed everything now becomes even more layered. Some changes arise in the deep ape past, like alterations tied to the tailless body plan. Some help shape bipedal anatomy. Some affect brain development, vocal control, immunity, or metabolism. But some important changes do not originate in the direct line that becomes Homo sapiens. They are borrowed, inherited through contact with other human groups. The modern human genome is therefore not only a record of our ancestors adapting, it is also a record of relatives encountered along the way. The boundary between us and them becomes porous, because the descendants of those meetings are alive. This does not mean every popular claim about lost humans should be accepted. Ancient DNA has made the story more fascinating, but it has also attracted exaggeration. Unsupported ideas about advanced vanished civilizations, secret superhuman lineages, or hidden races should not be confused with the actual evidence. The real story is already extraordinary without invention. Tiny fragments of bone and molecules preserved in cold caves have revealed that modern humans once shared the world with other human populations, interbred with them, inherited from them, and then outlasted them. No single explanation fully accounts for why one population survived and others did not. Climate, demography, disease, competition, absorption, culture, chance, and geography all likely played roles. By this point in the unfolding story, humanity no longer looks like a solitary flame. It looks like a braided fire, fed by many branches, some still visible, others burned down to ash but not entirely gone. The ancient ape body has become a moving, tool-making, learning human family. Its members spread across continents, adapt to cold mountains and warm forests, meet one another in landscapes now buried by time, and leave traces in stone, bone, sediment, and blood. The next mystery is not whether humans changed. It is how those changes became concentrated in one surviving species, Homo sapiens, whose origins in Africa would eventually send another wave of travelers into a world already occupied by relatives. The wave that eventually becomes modern humanity does not rise from an empty world, and it does not begin as a perfect version of us. Homo sapiens emerges in Africa from a long, shifting background of earlier humans, shaped by climate pulses, population separations, local adaptations, and repeated connections across landscapes that open and close like breathing. The old idea of one small birthplace, one valley, one sudden population that becomes modern and then marches outward has grown too narrow. Africa is not a single stage. It is immense, varied, and restless deserts expanding and retreating, lakes swelling and drying, forests thickening and fragmenting, grasslands spreading under changing skies, coasts offering shellfish and wetlands offering reeds, fish, birds, and plant foods. In such a continent, evolution does not need one center. It can work through many populations, sometimes isolated, sometimes connected, carrying different combinations of traits that gradually contribute to the species later called Homo sapiens. The fossils themselves show this uneven arrival. At Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, remains dating to around 300,000 years ago, reveal faces that look surprisingly modern in some ways, with a flatter, smaller face tucked beneath the brow, compared with many earlier humans. Yet the brain case is not fully modern in shape. It is longer and lower, less globular than that of living humans. That detail is crucial. The face seems to arrive before the full modern brain case form. Modern humanity does not appear all at once as a completed package. Other African fossils, including Homo kibish in Ethiopia and Herto in Ethiopia, show different pieces of the emerging pattern at different times. The evidence remains incomplete, and dating, classification, and interpretation continue to be refined. But the broad picture is clear enough. Homo sapiens is not born in a single instant. It gathers. This gathering is anatomical, genetic, and behavioral. The skull changes in several ways. The face becomes reduced and tucked under the brain case. The brow becomes less massive than in many earlier humans. The chin, a strange and distinctive feature of modern humans, appears as part of a reshaped jaw and face. The brain case becomes more rounded, especially in the parietal and cerebellar regions, producing the globular form typical of living people. But as always, bones are only the outer record. Behind them are developmental processes, gene regulation, growth timing, and the long interaction between biology and culture. Recent work on human-specific regulatory changes reminds us that small changes in when and where genes act during development can matter deeply. They may influence the growth of the cortex, the shape of the skull, the timing of neural development, and the long childhood during which human brains become saturated with learning. Yet it would be misleading to say that a new skull shape creates modern behavior by itself. The relationship between anatomy and culture is more complicated. Early Homo sapiens populations do not immediately produce agriculture, cities, writing, metal, or monuments. For most of their existence, they live as foragers, moving through landscapes, making stone tools, gathering plants, hunting animals, processing foods, caring for children. navigating social relationships, and surviving the same pressures that shaped older humans. The difference lies not in a sudden escape from nature, but in a growing capacity for flexibility and accumulation. Tools become more varied. Raw materials move over greater distances. Pigments such as ochre appear in contexts suggesting symbolic or practical uses, sometimes both. Shell beads and engraved objects appear in some later Middle Stone Age sites, though their meanings are debated. What survives in the record suggests minds capable of marking, remembering, signalling, and belonging. One lesser-known part of this story is how uneven early symbolic behavior appears. It is tempting to imagine a single creative explosion, especially when looking at the spectacular cave art of Ice Age Europe much later. But Africa preserves older, subtler traces: ochre pieces rubbed, ground, or engraved, shells pierced or transported, carefully prepared tool technologies, heat-treated stone, adhesives made through controlled processes, and networks of exchange or movement visible through the transport of materials. These do not always look dramatic to the modern eye. A small engraved ochre fragment is not a painted bison galloping across a cave wall. A bead is not a cathedral. But in deep time, such objects matter because they suggest that identity, memory, and social meaning may have been carried in portable, fragile forms long before the famous art of Europe. The environment keeps shaping the story. Africa during the later Middle Pleistocene and early Late Pleistocene is not stable. Rainfall belts shift. The Sahara alternates between harsher desert and greener periods with lakes and rivers. Coastlines move as sea levels rise and fall. Populations expand when conditions allow, and contract when drought or ecological stress intensifies. This repeated fragmentation may have been one of the engines of human diversity. Groups separated by deserts, forests, or climatic barriers can drift genetically and culturally. Later, when corridors reopen, they meet again, exchange genes, tools, ideas, mates, and perhaps stories. No single explanation fully accounts for the emergence of Homo sapiens. But this pattern of separation and reconnection helps explain why the species seems to form across a broad African network, rather than from one isolated point. The genetic record supports this deeper African complexity. Living humans carry the greatest genetic diversity in Africa, which is expected if the species has deep roots there. But the branching patterns are not simple. Ancient population structure within Africa likely contributed to the ancestry of later humans, and some ghost populations may have left traces without yet being matched to clear fossils. Just as Denisovans became visible through DNA before their physical form was well known, some African ancestral groups may be partially visible in genomes while their bones remain unnamed or undiscovered. Scholars still debate the details, but the message is powerful even within Africa. Modern human origins are braided, not linear. This braided origin also changes how the famous out-of-Africa expansion should be understood. Homo sapiens populations likely moved beyond Africa more than once. Some early excursions may have left little or no lasting ancestry in living people. Fossils and tools suggest modern humans reached parts of the eastern Mediterranean before the major expansion that later spread widely across Eurasia. These early movements may have failed, retreated, been absorbed, or left traces too faint to detect clearly. The expansion that matters most for living non-African ancestry seems to occur later, roughly within the last 70,000 years or so, though the timing and roots remain debated. But even this later movement is not a simple conquest. It is an encounter with a world already inhabited by Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps other human groups, the mutation that changed everything, then has become a whole ecology of change. In Homo sapiens, some of the decisive differences may lie in developmental regulation, neural plasticity, vocal and motor control, social learning, and the ability to maintain wider networks of exchange. But these traits do not operate separately. A symbolic object only matters in a social world that understands symbols. A complex tool only matters if skill can be learned and transmitted. A long childhood only works if others help support the young. A flexible brain needs a culture to fill it. The human advantage, if it can be called that, is not pure intelligence in isolation. It is the binding together of biology, learning, cooperation, memory, and environment into a system that can adapt faster than genes alone. By the time Homo sapiens begins to move more widely beyond Africa, the species carries within it the long history already told by the body, the missing tail of the ape inheritance, the upright posture of the hominin experiment, the hand shaped for manipulation, the costly brain extended through childhood, the social world that stores knowledge, and the genome still open to inheritance from other humans. Modern humans are not separate from the ancient world. They are ancient world transformed. They step outward not as the first humans, and not as the only humans, but as one branch among several, carrying a particular combination of traits that will soon make them the last surviving branch of a once crowded family. The travelers who leave Africa carry stone, memory, fire, hunger, children, and something more difficult to preserve than any bone. They carry an increasingly powerful command of sound, not speech in the theatrical sense of a sudden invention, not language appearing overnight like a tool lifted from the ground, but a deepening ability to shape breath, rhythm, gesture, attention, and meaning into forms that other minds can follow. The archaeological record cannot fossilize a sentence. It cannot preserve a warning spoken beside a river, the name of a plant taught to a child, the remembered location of water, the social tension before a hunt, or the quiet instructions needed to make a difficult tool. Yet by the time Homo sapiens begins to move widely through Eurasia, communication has become one of the most important parts of survival, and it is almost certainly built on foundations much older than modern humans themselves. The first thing to understand is that language does not emerge from silence. Other primates already live in social worlds full of signals. Chimpanzees gesture, call, threaten, reconcile, groom, beg, watch, deceive, and learn from one another. Monkeys use alarm calls. Birds learn songs. Whales pass vocal traditions through the sea. The human lineage does not invent communication from nothing. What changes is the degree of control, flexibility, shared attention, symbolic reach, and cultural accumulation. A human voice can carry information about things not present. It can coordinate action among several individuals. It can transmit technique, kinship, memory, warning, obligation, landscape, and eventually myth. But before speech becomes a river of meaning, the body must become capable of controlling air and sound with remarkable precision. This is one reason the evolution of language is so hard to reconstruct. It depends on many systems at once. The brain must plan and interpret sequences. The ears must process fine differences in sound. The breath must be controlled. The tongue, lips, jaw, soft palate, larynx, and throat must coordinate rapid movements. The body must support social learning, imitation, memory, and intention. No single bone records all of that. The hyoid bone in the throat can offer clues. and the shape of the skull base and vocal tract can be discussed, but these are incomplete windows. Neanderthals, for example, possessed anatomy and genes suggesting capacities far more sophisticated than older stereotypes allowed. They were not mute brutes. The evidence remains incomplete, but the idea that language belonged only to Homo sapiens in a simple all-or-nothing way has become increasingly difficult to defend. Genes once seemed to promise a shortcut into this mystery. FOXP2 became famous because rare mutations in this gene can disrupt speech and language in living humans, especially affecting the coordination and sequencing of mouth movements and grammar-related abilities. For a time, it was described in popular accounts almost like a key to speech. But biology resisted the simplicity. FOXP2 is not a language gene by itself. It exists in many animals and plays roles in neural circuits, learning, and motor control. Neanderthals and Denisovans appear to have carried the same major protein coding version found in modern humans, which means the origin of human-like speech cannot be explained by one FOXP2 mutation separating Homo sapiens from all other humans. The deeper differences may lie elsewhere, in regulation, networks, timing, and combinations of many variants. More recent research points toward this broader view. Genes such as NOVA1 involved in regulating RNA processing in the brain have drawn attention because a human-specific version may influence neural development and vocalization-related patterns in experimental models. The finding is fascinating because it suggests that changes affecting how many other genes are processed and expressed could have cascading effects. A single altered amino acid or regulatory difference may not create language, but if it changes neural timing, circuit development, or vocal motor control, it could become part of the larger architecture that makes human speech possible. Still, caution is essential. A laboratory model is not a recording of an Ice Age voice. Scholars still debate how such findings should be interpreted, and no experiment can recreate the vanished social world in which ancient communication evolved. There are also environmental shadows around the story. Some researchers have explored whether exposure to toxins such as lead may have affected neurological development in Neanderthals and other extinct hominins, potentially influencing cognition, hearing, speech, or social behavior in subtle ways. Such ideas are intriguing because they remind us that brains evolve and develop in real environments, not in clean diagrams. Ancient humans breathe smoke, drink mineral-rich water, handle pigments, live near caves, process materials, and move through landscapes where metals and toxins can enter the body. Yet these hypotheses remain cautious and limited. They do not explain Neanderthal disappearance by themselves, and they should not be turned into a simple claim that one group failed because another had cleaner brains. Human survival is never that tidy. What can be said more securely is that communication and culture reinforce each other. The more a group depends on learned skills, the more valuable accurate transmission becomes. Toolmaking traditions benefit from demonstration and correction. Hunting benefits from coordination. Gathering benefits from shared knowledge of season, plant, poison, medicine, and location. Childcare benefits from social signals and trust. Long-distance exchange benefits from identity and agreement. Ritual, if present, depends on shared meaning. Even before full symbolic language in the modern sense, hominins likely rely on gesture, vocal rhythm, facial expression, pointing, imitation, and emotional attunement. Gradually, these channels become a system capable of carrying more than immediate feeling. They become a way to move knowledge from one skull into another. This may be one of the hidden advantages of Homo sapiens during expansion. Not necessarily that every individual is smarter than every Neanderthal or Denisovan, because that claim goes beyond the evidence and rests on old prejudices. Rather, Homo sapiens populations may have maintained larger or more flexible social networks in some contexts, allowing information, mates, materials, and innovations to move across wider distances. A new tool form, a better way to prepare pigment. A route through difficult land, or a memory of seasonal abundance can survive longer if groups are connected. When populations are small and isolated, knowledge can disappear by chance. A skilled individual dies. A technique is not copied. A group fails during a harsh climate swing, and a tradition vanishes. Culture is powerful, but it is fragile unless carried by networks large enough to protect it. The archaeological record hints at this expanding symbolic and social reach. Shell beads, ochre use, engraved objects, long-distance raw material movement, carefully made blades, bone tools, and later cave paintings all suggest that human groups increasingly live inside worlds of shared meaning. Not every mark is art. Not every pigment is ritual. Ochre can preserve hides, repel insects, prepare adhesives, mark bodies, or signal identity. And sometimes several uses may overlap. What survives in the record suggests that symbolism does not replace practicality. It grows through it. A coloured body can be beautiful, social, intimidating, sacred, or useful all at once. A bead can be decoration, identity, memory, alliance, or belonging. The human mind does not separate function and meaning as cleanly as modern categories do. Speech, if it is now fully present or nearly so, turns these meanings into something portable. A stone tool must be carried by hand. A story can be carried in memory. A warning can travel faster than experience. A child can learn about a dangerous animal before meeting it. A group can remember a place beyond the horizon. A dead person can remain socially present through spoken memory. This does not make early Homo sapiens modern in every cultural sense, but it gives them a powerful way to accumulate and preserve survival knowledge. The mutation that changed everything now appears not as a single change in the throat or brain, but as a long convergence genetic regulation, neural development, vocal control, social tolerance, childhood learning, and culture feeding back into one another. The voice leaves no fossil, yet it may be one of the great invisible tools of human evolution. It helps bind the walking body, the working hand, and the hungry brain into a group that can remember more than one lifetime. As Homo sapiens moves deeper into Eurasia, this invisible tool travels with them into landscapes already occupied by other humans. There, the story of evolution becomes not only adaptation to climate and terrain, but contact meetings between voices, bodies, customs, and genomes at the edge of a changing world. Contact is rarely visible in a single dramatic scene. The imagination wants two groups standing across a valley from one another, modern humans on one side, Neanderthals or Denisovans on the other, each recognizing something familiar and unfamiliar in the face of the other. But the record does not preserve such meetings as pictures. It preserves them as stone tools in layered sediment, bones with uncertain owners, cave deposits, teeth, ornaments, cuts on animal remains, and, more recently, molecules that survive where the body itself has almost disappeared. The true encounters between human groups may have been brief, repeated, tense, cooperative, violent, intimate, or all of these at different times. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single discovery can restore the full texture of those meetings. Yet the genetic record leaves no doubt about the central fact they happened. When Homo sapiens moves into Eurasia, Neanderthals are already there. They know cold valleys, limestone shelters, river corridors, steppe edges, forests, and the movements of large animals. Their bodies are powerful, with broad trunks, strong limbs, large noses, and skeletal features often interpreted as adaptations to demanding climates and intense physical lives. They make tools, control fire, hunt, process hides, care for injured individuals, and occupy places over long spans. In older stories, they were pushed into the role of doomed primitives, waiting for modern humans to arrive and replace them. That image is too crude. Neanderthals are not a failed rehearsal for humanity. They are humanity in another form, shaped by their own history. The meetings between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals are recorded most clearly in DNA. Most living people with ancestry outside sub-Saharan Africa carry a small percentage of Neanderthal ancestry, inherited from interbreeding that likely occurred after modern humans expanded from Africa into Eurasia. Some African populations also carry traces indirectly, through later back migration and population mixing. These inherited segments are not evenly distributed through the genome. Some regions appear depleted of Neanderthal ancestry, suggesting that certain inherited variants were harmful in the background of modern human populations and were removed by selection over time. Other regions persisted, and some may have influenced immune function, skin biology, metabolism, inflammation, and responses to pathogens. This is not a simple story of ancient gifts. Some variants may have helped under one condition and harmed under another. Evolution preserves usefulness only in context, and context changes. Denisovan ancestry adds an even more mysterious layer. Unlike Neanderthals, Denisovans are known from very few physical remains, yet their genetic traces reveal deep influence in parts of Asia and Oceania. Some present-day populations in New Guinea and nearby regions carry notable Denisovan ancestry, while smaller amounts appear in various Asian populations. The pattern suggests that modern humans did not meet just one uniform Denisovan group. They may have encountered several Denisovan-related populations, spread across different environments and separated by long spans of time. The name Denisovan comes from a Siberian cave, but the ancestry points far beyond Siberia, toward a vast missing geography of archaic humans whose bones have barely been found. This is one of the strangest contradictions in the human past. The population known from one small cave may have shaped the biology of people living thousands of kilometers away. The fossil record is so sparse that a casual observer might think Denisovans were rare or localized. The genetic record suggests otherwise. They may have lived across enormous regions of Asia, perhaps in mountains, forests, highlands, river valleys, and tropical zones where preservation is poor. Teeth and bone fragments survive in a few places. Cave sediment preserves DNA where no recognizable human bone remains. Ancient proteins from fossils can reveal relationships when DNA is gone. Each method opens a different window, but all of them show how badly damaged the archive is. The vanished human world was almost certainly richer than the visible record suggests. The Tibetan Plateau offers one of the clearest examples of archaic inheritance becoming part of modern adaptation. High altitude is a severe test for the body. Thin air means less oxygen, and the wrong physiological response can strain blood, heart, lungs, pregnancy, and growth. Tibetans carry a version of the Apes 1 region associated with adaptation to high-altitude life, and evidence indicates that this variant came from Denisovan-related ancestry. The detail is almost poetic. though it should not be over-romanticized. A genetic variant shaped in an archaic human population entered the ancestors of modern humans through interbreeding, and later natural selection favored it in a high mountain environment. A meeting in deep time becomes easier breathing under a high sky. Other inherited archaic variants may have affected immunity. This makes sense because moving into new regions means meeting new pathogens, parasites, foods, climates, and ecological risks. A population long adapted to one environment may carry immune variants useful to newcomers, but the bargain can be dangerous. Immune systems are powerful precisely because they can harm the body when misdirected. A variant that helps defend against ancient infection might increase risk for inflammation or autoimmune problems in a modern environment. The legacy of interbreeding is therefore not a treasure chest of improvements. It is a mixed inheritance, filtered by natural selection, population history, and changing conditions. The meetings themselves remain hidden behind these outcomes. Interbreeding does not tell us whether groups lived together for years, exchanged mates through alliance, took captives, merged after population collapse, or met only occasionally along moving frontiers. It does not tell us what they thought of one another. It does not tell us whether their speech was mutually understandable, whether their gestures carried familiar meanings, whether children of mixed ancestry were fully accepted, or whether some encounters ended in fear. Scholars still debate the social reality behind the genetic signatures because genes record descent, not emotion. What survives in the record suggests contact, but not the human texture of contact. The archaeological record also complicates easy distinctions. Tool traditions do not always map neatly onto species. A type of stone tool cannot automatically be assigned to Homo sapiens or Neanderthals without supporting evidence. Cultural behaviors can spread, converge, or be reinvented. In some periods, Neanderthal-associated industries show complexity, planning, and regional variation. Early Homo sapiens technologies are also diverse, and not every modern human group carries the same toolkit. When populations meet, ideas may move without much genetic exchange, and genes may move without obvious tool changes. Culture and biology do not always travel together. This is where the old ladder of human evolution finally breaks apart. There is no pure line rising from ancient ape to modern person, untouched by other branches. There is a lineage, yes, but it is crossed by meetings. The human genome carries traces of separations and reunions, of local adaptation and borrowed survival. Some mutations arise deep in the ape past. Some evolve in early hominins. Some become important in Homo sapiens within Africa. Others enter from Neanderthals or Denisovans after long separation. The phrase modern human can make the story sound clean, but the body quietly disagrees. In skin, immunity, blood, oxygen response, and fragments of non-coding DNA, the past remains mixed. The consequence is profound. The humans who eventually become the last surviving species are not isolated conquerors. They are inheritors. They inherit from apes, from upright walkers, from toolmakers, from African ancestors, and from other human populations encountered beyond Africa. Their success cannot be reduced to one superior mutation, one better brain, one sharper tool, or one dramatic replacement. It comes from a changing combination of biology, culture, demography, mobility, and chance. And beneath that success lies a more unsettling truth. The line between survival and disappearance may have been far thinner than later history makes it appear. The meetings with other humans make one thing unavoidable. Survival is no longer carried by the body alone. It is carried by habits, memories, skills, signals, and traditions that can outlive any single person. By the later Pleistocene, the human story has become a story of culture in the deepest sense. Not culture as decoration after survival is secure, but culture as survival itself. A stone blade, a hearth, a pigment stain, a shell bead, a bone point, a carefully chosen campsite, a remembered migration route, a rule about marriage partners, a way of preparing skins, a method for finding water in a dry season. All of these become part of the extended human organism. The genome still matters, mutations still arise, natural selection still works, but knowledge now moves through groups with a speed and flexibility that DNA can never match. This is one of the great thresholds in the evolution from ancient apes to modern humans. The earliest changes are written into bodies: the missing tail, the upright pelvis, the foot that becomes a lever, the hand that grips and strikes, the skull that slowly changes shape, the developing brain shaped by regulatory shifts and long childhood. But culture changes the rules of the game. A genetic adaptation may take thousands of years to become common. A learned technique can spread in a season if people are connected enough. A population does not need to evolve thicker fur if it can make better clothing. It does not need claws if it has points and blades. It does not need to grow a new stomach if it can cook, pound, soak, ferment, or detoxify food through knowledge. Biology creates the capacity for culture, and then culture begins to shield, redirect, and intensify biology. This does not mean ancient humans step outside nature. That is one of the oldest mistakes in telling the story. A person wrapped in hides, carrying a blade, and speaking around a fire is still an animal inside an ecosystem. Hunger, cold, infection, injury, childbirth, predators, drought, and conflict remain real, but the human animal increasingly survives by building small buffers against the world. Shelter buffers weather, fire buffers darkness and cold, tools buffer weakness. Cooperation buffers individual failure, memory buffers seasonal uncertainty, symbolism buffers social distance, allowing people to recognize belonging, identity, alliance, and difference before violence or trust must be tested the hard way. The archaeological signs of this growing cultural world are scattered and uneven. In some places, tools become more standardized and specialized. In others, older technologies continue for astonishing length of time, not because their makers are unintelligent, but because the tools work. Archaeology is full of this quiet correction to modern arrogance. A simple flake can be extremely effective. A tradition may persist because it solves the problem at hand, not because its makers are incapable of innovation. Change in prehistory is not always a straight march toward complexity. Sometimes the most elegant technology is the one that can be made quickly, repaired easily, and abandoned without regret. Still, there are moments when the record shows a clear thickening of behavior. In Africa, Middle Stone Age sites preserve prepared core technologies, points, blades, ochre use, heat treatment of stone, and compound tools made with adhesives. The making of adhesive is especially revealing. It may require selecting the right plant resin, gum, or bitumen, combining it with other materials, heating or drying it properly, and using it to attach a stone point to a wooden shaft. Such a tool is not merely a sharp rock. It is a system of materials, each with different properties, brought together through remembered procedure. The finished object hides the intelligence of the process. A broken point in the soil may look small, but behind it stands a chain of choices, In Europe and Western Asia, Neanderthals also make complex tools, use fire, process hides, hunt dangerous animals, and in some cases use pigments, feathers, claws, or other materials that may have carried symbolic meaning. Scholars still debate the interpretation of many of these finds, especially when dating is difficult or when later disturbance may have mixed layers. But the old division between symbolic Homo sapiens and purely practical Neanderthals has weakened. The evidence remains incomplete, yet it suggests that several human groups possess deeper behavioral capacities than earlier stereotypes allowed. The differences between them may have been matters of demography, network size, ecological flexibility, and cumulative tradition as much as raw intelligence. Cumulative culture is fragile. It depends on enough people learning from enough other people across enough time. A small isolated group can lose a complex skill simply because the few experts die, because children do not observe enough examples, because harsh conditions reduce time for practice, or because a tool is no longer needed for several generations. This may help explain why innovation appears unevenly in the record. A technique can be invented, disappear, and be reinvented elsewhere. A population can know something and then lose it. The archaeological record may not show a steady climb, because human knowledge itself does not always climb. It flickers, spreads, contracts, and sometimes goes dark. One lesser-known detail is that ancient humans often move materials in ways that reveal invisible social geographies. A stone found far from its geological source means someone carried it, traded it, or moved across that distance. Shells found inland suggest travel, exchange, or symbolic value. Pigments transported to sites where they do not naturally occur suggest planning and preference. These objects become faint maps of relationships. They show that the human world is not only where a group sleeps and eats, it includes places remembered, visited, exchanged with, avoided, or imagined. The mind is stretching across the landscape before maps exist. At the same time, the body continues to evolve inside this cultural web. Long childhood becomes even more important when there is more to learn. A young human must master foods, tools, dangers, gestures, social expectations, kin relationships, and eventually language. This makes children costly, but it also turns each generation into a carrier of accumulated knowledge. Older individuals may become valuable not only because they reproduce, but because they remember. A grandmother who knows drought foods, a skilled toolmaker who can correct a mistake, a hunter who understands animal movement, a healer who recognizes a plant. All can influence survival in ways that leave no direct fossil. The social body becomes larger than the physical body. The mutation that changed everything now looks less like a single genetic spark and more like the emergence of a new evolutionary engine. Genetic changes help produce a creature capable of high-fidelity learning, flexible communication, fine motor control, long memory, and deep cooperation. Culture then feeds back into selection. Groups that maintain useful knowledge may survive crises better. Individuals better able to learn, teach, coordinate, or read social signals may gain advantages. But culture also creates new pressures dependence on group life, vulnerability to exclusion, conflict over resources, and the burden of keeping traditions alive. No single explanation fully accounts for why Homo sapiens eventually becomes the only surviving human species. But culture is part of the answer, especially when joined with demography and connection. A group linked to wider networks can recover from local failure. It can borrow tools, mates, materials, and ideas. It can preserve knowledge beyond the limits of one camp. It can move through changing climates with a shared memory larger than one mind. The human body has already risen from the ape inheritance. Now the human world begins to rise around it, made not of cities yet, not of writing, not of kingdoms, but of small, portable traditions carried by voices, hands, and firelight. The cultural world grows brighter in the record, but around it the older human diversity begins to dim. For hundreds of thousands of years, Earth does not belong to one kind of human. It is shared by forms adapted to different regions, different climates, different histories. Neanderthals hold much of Europe and Western Asia. Denisovan-related populations leave genetic shadows across Asia and Oceania. Other humans survive in island landscapes, tropical forests, and remote ecological pockets. Sometimes known from only a skull, a jaw, a tooth, or a handful of stone tools, Homo sapiens is not alone in intelligence, not alone in endurance, not alone in tool-making, and not alone in social life. Yet by the time the last ice age loosens its grip and the world approaches the warmer interval that will later allow agriculture, only one human species remains. The question is not why humans evolved from ancient apes. By now, that has become a long chain of anatomy, genes, climate, behavior, and culture. The sharper question is why so many human branches disappear. Neanderthals are the most visible case because their record is richer than that of most extinct humans. They survive through repeated glacial cycles, adapt to cold and seasonal environments, hunt large animals, make stone tools, use fire, and leave signs of care for injured or impaired individuals. They are strong, skilled, and deeply experienced in landscapes that modern humans enter as newcomers. Their disappearance, around 40,000 years ago in broad terms, has often been presented as a simple defeat. Homo sapiens arrives, Neanderthals vanish. But the closer the evidence is examined, the less satisfying that simple story becomes. No single explanation fully accounts for their end. Climate instability, small population size, low genetic diversity, competition, disease, interbreeding, and chance may all have contributed, and their importance probably varied from place to place. Small populations are vulnerable in ways that large populations are not. A group can be well adapted and still fail if numbers are low. A harsh winter, a failed hunting season, a disease outbreak, a dangerous childbirth, a landslide blocking a route, or the death of a few skilled adults can matter enormously. In small groups, inbreeding can increase. Genetic drift can remove useful variation by chance. Cultural knowledge can vanish if not enough learners remain. A population does not need to be inferior to disappear. It only needs to become fragile in a world that keeps changing. This is one of the quiet truths of prehistory, and it makes extinction feel less like judgment and more like weather. Climate adds pressure. The later Pleistocene is not a calm background. It is a world of rapid oscillations, cold pulses, shifting vegetation, moving animal herds, and unstable habitats. A region that supports large prey and familiar routes for generations can change within a timescale short enough to stress human groups. Neanderthals endure such instability for a long time, but endurance is not immunity. If their populations are already scattered and relatively small, repeated environmental shocks may weaken connections between groups. Isolation can make recovery harder. When a local population disappears, neighboring groups may not be numerous enough to replace it. The map becomes patchy, then thinner, then silent. Homo sapiens may have had demographic advantages in some regions. Wider social networks could have helped modern human groups exchange mates, materials, and information across longer distances. If one group suffers, others may provide connection. If one technique fails, another may spread. If raw material is scarce in one place, exchange can buffer the shortage. This does not mean Homo sapiens is smarter in a simple, universal way. It means that population structure and social connectivity can shape survival as powerfully as individual ability. A large, connected network can preserve variation, both genetic and cultural. A small, isolated one can lose it. Competition may also have mattered, but not always as direct violence. Two human groups using similar landscapes may compete for animal herds, shelters, stone sources, fuel, and seasonal routes. Even a slight difference in reproductive rate, child survival, mobility, or network size can accumulate over millennia. Replacement does not require constant battle. It can happen through slow demographic pressure. A newcomer population expands during favorable periods, occupies more sites, absorbs local groups through interbreeding, and leaves fewer places where the older population can persist. The result, viewed from far away, looks sudden, lived on the ground. It may have been uneven, local, and drawn out. Interbreeding complicates the idea of disappearance further. Neanderthals do not vanish without leaving descendants. Their ancestry remains in many living people. Denisovan ancestry remains too, especially in parts of Oceania and Asia. This means extinction, in the biological sense, can coexist with genetic survival. The groups disappear as distinct populations, but fragments of them continue inside the genome of the species that remains. It is a strange form of afterlife, without memory, language, or name. A Neanderthal child born into a mixed community may have carried traditions from one group into another. A Denisovan-related variant useful in high mountains could pass through generations long after the population that first carried it ceased to exist as a separate people. What survives in the record suggests endings that are not clean. Other human disappearances are even harder to explain. Homo floresiensis on the island of Flores, with its small body and unusual anatomy, appears to represent a long isolated island lineage, though its exact ancestry remains debated. Homo luzonensis in the Philippines is known from fragmentary remains that hint at yet another unexpected human form in island Southeast Asia. These discoveries show that late human diversity was not limited to Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens. Islands can preserve ancient lineages in strange ways, shrinking bodies, isolating populations, and creating evolutionary experiments far from continental histories. But island populations are also vulnerable. Volcanic eruptions, ecological change, limited range, and contact with new arrivals can erase them quickly in geological terms. The Denisovans remain the greatest absence. Their disappearance cannot be dated in the same clear way as Neanderthals, because their fossil record is so thin and their population structure may have been broad and complex. Some Denisovan-related groups may have survived longer in parts of Asia than the few Siberian bones suggest. Some may have been absorbed by expanding Homo sapiens populations. Some may have vanished under climate pressure or local demographic collapse. Scholars still debate their range, appearance, culture, and final fate because so much of the evidence is genetic rather than skeletal. They are a reminder that the human past contains not only missing answers, but missing people. By the end of this long narrowing, Homo sapiens stands alone, but the word alone is misleading. The surviving species is crowded inside. It carries ape inheritance in its bones, archaic inheritance in its DNA, Pleistocene memory in its tools, and cultural inheritance in its capacity to learn from the dead through objects, marks, and stories. The disappearance of other humans is not the triumph of one perfect form. It is the outcome of unstable climates, moving populations, fragile demography, interbreeding, adaptation, and chance. The ancient ape did not evolve into a single inevitable master of Earth. Many human branches tried to live. One remains, carrying pieces of several. The narrowing of the human family leaves a silence that is easy to mistake for certainty. Because only Homo sapiens survives, the past can seem arranged to produce us, as though every vanished branch were merely a failed step on the way to the present. But that is not what the evidence shows. The evidence shows a world crowded with experiments, ancient apes without tails, early hominins balancing between trees and ground, Australopithecines walking with bodies still partly built for climbing, early Homo carrying stone tools across wider landscapes, Neanderthals enduring cold Eurasian cycles, Denisovans leaving genetic shadows across Asia, island humans shrinking and changing in isolation, and Homo sapiens emerging from a deep African network rather than a single perfect birthplace. The surviving species is not the answer to a plan. It is the remnant of a branching process, and survival itself is not proof of destiny. This is why the search for the mutation that changed everything must end in a more complicated place than it began. The phrase is powerful because some mutations do matter enormously. A mobile DNA insertion near TBXT may have helped reshape the tail development program in the ancestor of apes. Regulatory changes in human-accelerated regions may have altered the timing and pattern of brain and limb development. Enhancers active in the forming cortex may have influenced neural progenitor cells, helping shape the conditions for a larger and more plastic brain. Changes in genes involved in RNA regulation, vocal motor circuits, and neural development may have contributed to the long evolution of speech and language. Variants inherited from archaic humans may have affected immunity, skin, metabolism, and high-altitude adaptation. These are not minor footnotes. They are among the hidden mechanisms by which bodies and minds are built. But none of them stands alone. A mutation is not a story until it enters a body, a population, an environment, and time. A genetic change that slightly alters development can disappear if its carriers leave no descendants. A harmful change can persist if linked to another useful trait, or if selection is weak. A useful variant in one landscape can become useless in another. A trait can be favored for one reason and later become important for something else entirely. Tail loss did not evolve so that humans could sit in chairs or balance over two legs. Bipedalism does not evolve so that hands could one day write, carve, type, or build spacecraft. Brain plasticity did not evolve in anticipation of mathematics or mythology. Evolution has no foresight. It works with immediate survival, reproduction, constraint, and chance, and only later do descendants look back and see a path. The deeper pattern is not one mutation, but modular change. The body is assembled from interacting systems: the spine, pelvis, legs, feet, hands, skull, brain, voice, immune system, and metabolism do not evolve independently, but neither do they all change at once. Each system carries old compromises. The missing tail belongs to the ape inheritance. The pelvis belongs to the bipedal experiment. The hand belongs to a primate history of grasping redirected toward tools. The brain belongs to a mammalian nervous system expanded and reorganized through development. The voice belongs to an older animal capacity for sound and breath, refined through neural and social control. The immune system belongs to a long struggle with pathogens, sharpened further by contact with new environments and other humans. The human being is not a new invention. It is a renovation of ancient materials. Modern genomics makes this clearer by revealing how much of evolution happens outside the old spotlight of protein-coding genes. The genome is not a tidy instruction manual with one page for each trait. It is more like a landscape of coding sequences, regulatory elements, repeats, structural variants, duplicated regions, mobile elements, switches, silencers, enhancers, and regions whose functions remain uncertain. Some of the most important differences between humans and other apes may lie in when genes are activated, in which cells, at what intensity, and for how long. A protein can remain nearly the same while its use changes dramatically. This helps explain how closely related animals can share much of their genetic toolkit and still grow into very different forms. A lesser-known difficulty is that some of the most evolutionarily dynamic parts of the genome have been among the hardest to study. Repetitive DNA, duplicated regions, centromeres, and structurally complex sequences were once difficult to assemble and compare accurately. As ape genomes become more complete, the comparison between humans, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans, and gibbons becomes richer and less simplistic. The question is no longer only which genes humans have that other apes lack. Often, humans do not have a unique gene at all. They have a shared gene used differently, a duplicated segment altered in dosage, a regulatory sequence changed in timing, or a repetitive element inserted into a place where it affects development. What survives in the genome suggests that some of the most consequential edits may have been hidden in regions that older methods could not fully read. This changes the emotional meaning of human uniqueness. Humans are unusual, but not because they stand outside life. They are unusual because ordinary evolutionary processes, repeated for millions of years, produced a creature capable of asking where it came from. The same mechanisms that shape beetle wings, whale limbs, bird beaks, and orchid flowers also shape the human spine, hand, cortex, and voice. Mutation, selection, drift, gene flow, development, constraint, and extinction are not mystical forces. They are the deep grammar of biology. Yet when they operate across enough time, the results feel almost impossible. A small genetic insertion can alter a tail. A slight developmental shift can influence a pelvis. A regulatory change can affect the number of cells in a forming brain region. A learned toolmaking tradition can change diet. A social network can preserve knowledge. An interbreeding event can move an altitude adaptation variant into a population that will one day live beneath thin mountain air. The most unsettling part is how fragile the chain is. Remove one population, change one climate corridor, lose one small group to drought, prevent one meeting between archaic and modern humans. Let one useful tradition disappear before it spreads. The present could be different in ways impossible to calculate. This does not mean human evolution was random in the sense of meaningless chaos. Natural selection is not random in its filtering, but the raw material it works on, the environments it encounters, and the populations that happen to survive are filled with contingency. The human story is both lawful and accidental, It follows biological rules, but it does not follow a script. By the time the other human branches fade, Homo sapiens carries this whole layered inheritance forward. In every living person there is a body shaped by ancient ape transformations, a gait shaped by hominin compromise, a hand shaped by tool use and touch, a brain shaped by development and childhood, a voice shaped by social need, and a genome shaped by both deep ancestry and ancient encounters. The mutation that changed everything is therefore not one mutation. It is the realization that tiny changes can become enormous when time, environment, and culture amplify them. A tail disappears, and millions of years later a species without a tail looks back into the dark, trying to understand why it stands upright, why it speaks, why it remembers, and why all the other human voices have gone quiet. The living human body is a museum with no walls. Its exhibits are not arranged behind glass, and most of them are never noticed. Yet they are carried everywhere in the curve of the spine, the shape of the pelvis, the arch of the foot, the thumb folding toward the fingers, the slow-growing brain of a child, the restless voice, the tailbone at the base of the body, and the genome written into every cell. The long journey from ancient apes to modern humans does not end in a cave painting, a spear point, a skull, or a migration map. It ends, for now, in the bodies of people alive today, each one carrying an inheritance older than memory and more complicated than any simple origin story can hold. Some of that inheritance is obvious only when compared with other apes. Humans stand with the head balanced above the spine, but this balance depends on a chain of modifications that began long before Homo sapiens existed. The pelvis is short and broad, the spine curves, the legs carry the body in alternating steps, and the foot has become a platform and lever rather than a grasping organ. Yet these adaptations are imperfect, because evolution works by modification, not by clean design. The lower back aches, knees fail, hips wear down. Childbirth is dangerous compared with many other mammals. The coccyx remains where a tail once extended, not as a useless joke, but as a reminder that the human form is a changed ape form, carrying both the advantages and the costs of its history. Other parts of the inheritance are less visible. Inside the genome, researchers find traces of deep ape ancestry, human-specific regulatory changes, ancient population separations, and encounters with extinct relatives. Some genetic differences affect proteins, but many act through timing, dosage, and regulation. They influence when a gene is used, where it is used, and how strongly it speaks during development. This is one of the great lessons of recent science. Humanity is not explained by a handful of special genes that appeared from nowhere. It is shaped by shared genes used in altered ways, by mobile DNA insertions, by enhancers, by structural changes, by repetitive regions once difficult to read, and by interactions that remain only partly understood. The evidence remains incomplete, but it grows sharper each year as genomes of living apes, ancient humans, and present-day populations become more fully compared. Even the brain, so often treated as the throne of human uniqueness, belongs to this layered inheritance. It is not separate from the body story. It depends on long childhood, social feeding, protection, learning, and the energy economy created by tools, food processing, cooperation, and eventually fire. Its development is influenced by genetic regulation, but its contents are filled by culture. A newborn does not inherit a language in the genetic code. A child inherits the capacity to learn language and then receive speech from a living community. A child does not inherit the memory of how to make a blade, prepare a plant, follow animal tracks, or recognize kinship rules. Those are learned. Biology opens the door, and culture passes through it. This is why the boundary between mutation and meaning becomes so fascinating. A mutation may alter a developmental pathway. A regulatory change may influence a brain region. A variant inherited from Denisovan-related ancestry may help some populations live at high altitude. A Neanderthal segment may affect immune response in one context and create risk in another. But none of these variants carries a story by itself. The story emerges when genes meet bodies, bodies meet environments, and communities turn survival into memory. A useful trait becomes powerful only in the right world. A voice matters because others can hear it. A hand matters because it can learn. A brain matters because it grows among other brains. The most surprising legacy may be that modern humans are not pure descendants of a single clean line. People carry ancestry from populations that no longer exist as separate groups. Neanderthals and Denisovans are gone, but fragments of their genetic history remain in living bodies. This does not make anyone less human. It makes humanity more deeply human, because it reveals that the species is built from contact, separation, reunion, and inheritance. The old family tree is really a network of branches that sometimes split and sometimes braided together again. Some branches vanished completely. Some vanished as peoples but survived as traces. Some may still be hidden in genomes, waiting to be recognized when science becomes sharp enough to see them. The same is true of culture. The people of the deep past did not leave full biographies. They left stone tools, burnt patches, pigments, bones, beads, footprints, cut marks, sediments, and DNA. Most of their gestures vanished. Most of their voices vanished. Their names, if they had names, are gone. Their fears, jokes, loyalties, and small daily habits are mostly beyond recovery. Yet the continuity is still there. Every time a human child watches an adult and learns, every time a group shares food, every time a tool extends the hand, every time a story carries memory beyond one lifetime, the old evolutionary engine continues. The form has changed, but the principle is ancient. Survival is not carried by strength alone. It is carried by bodies that can learn from one another. Scholars still debate many of the details. They debate the exact placement of early apes, the locomotion of the earliest hominins, the timing of key migrations, the range of Denisovans, the depth of symbolic behavior, the causes of Neanderthal disappearance, and the genetic architecture of language and cognition. That uncertainty is not weakness. It is the nature of a science built from fragments. A tooth can revise a map. A jaw can reopen an argument. A few molecules in cave sediment can reveal a vanished population. A new genome assembly can make a once invisible region readable. The story keeps changing because the past is not finished speaking. And so the mutation that changed everything becomes something larger than its title. It is the tail lost in the ancestor of apes. It is the pelvis reshaped for walking. It is the hand refined for touch and force. It is the regulatory switch that subtly changes development. It is the brain made teachable by a long childhood. It is the voice turned into shared memory. It is also the meeting with other humans, the borrowed variant, the absorbed lineage, the fragile tradition that survives because one generation teaches the next. Humanity is not the product of one spark. It is a fire kept alive by countless small sparks, most of them invisible, many of them accidental, all of them carried forward through time. The story slows here, not because it is over, but because its scale becomes too wide to hold all at once. Behind every living person stretches a line of ancestors who survived enough winters, droughts, illnesses, births, journeys, and losses for one more generation to appear. Most of them left no monument, most left no bone that will ever be found. They passed through forests, grasslands, caves, riverbanks, coasts, deserts, and ice-edged worlds, carrying children, tools, hunger, memory, and the quiet pressure to endure. Some were not yet human in the modern sense. Some were ancient apes moving through branches with bodies already beginning to change. Some were early walkers, awkward and vulnerable, still close to the trees. Some struck stones together beside carcasses under dangerous skies. Some crossed out of Africa into lands where no ancestor of theirs had ever stood. Some met other humans whose names are gone forever. Some disappeared as separate peoples, leaving only faint fragments in the blood of descendants who would never know them. The human body remembers what the mind cannot. It remembers in bone, in balance, in breath, in pain, in birth, in the strange little tailbone at the end of the spine. The genome remembers in a colder language, written without intention, edited by mutation, chance, selection, and contact. Culture remembers differently, through teaching, gesture, imitation, story, and the objects left behind when hands release them into the earth. There is no single moment when the ape becomes human. There is no one mutation standing alone in the dark. There is only the long unfolding of life changing itself, generation after generation, until a creature appears that can look back and wonder how it came to stand upright beneath the sky. And somewhere beneath that question is the oldest image of all, not a city, not a throne, not a written page, but a small body moving through an ancient landscape, carrying within it changes it cannot understand, toward a future it will never see.